السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نحمده ونصلي على رسول النبي الكريم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. قال الله تعالى في شان حبيبي إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وسلم على سيدنا مولانا محمد وبارك وسلم عليه صلاة وسلاما عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Today is the 12th of Rabi al-Thani. So, of course, last month was Rabi al-Awwal. And as we know, Rabi means spring. So last month was the first spring, and this month is the second spring. Last month is the day of the month in which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sultani awliya, the Sayyidul Anbiya, the master and leader of the prophets, was born. And this month is the celebration of Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani, rahmatullahi alayhi, who is the Sultani awliya, the prince or the king of the friends of Allah. I'm going to relate this to things that are going on today. And of course everybody knows things that are going on today. There's a saying that a nation that does not know its past has no future. If you don't know your history, then you have no future. Because if you look at history, your history repeats itself. And the reason for that is that people don't learn. The psychology of man has not changed from the beginning. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the psychology of man, the various psychologies of men in the Quran. Of course, last week we spoke about one of those psychologies, which is mentioned in one of the verses in Surah Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ لَا تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَقَالُوا إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُصْلِحُونَ. And when it is said to them that do not create mischief on the earth, they respond by saying, oh, we are the peacemakers. And this is one of the things that's very prevalent today. Because might is right in today's society. And so those who have the biggest stick, control the media, control people's thoughts. And this is again what we are seeing. And this isn't something new. This is something that historically has come and gone. The tendency of men is that, when things get to a certain point, then people start doing what's right because they realize that's the only way of getting out of the situation they're in. And then when things fall back into balance, over time people forget. And so the situation goes back to chaos, imbalance, where injustice is prevalent. And this again is what we are seeing today. The thing is that in order to be able to correct the imbalance, to correct the injustice, you have to know how it was corrected before. Because it's the same thing that's going to fix it now that fixed it, 500 years ago, that fixed it 1,400 years ago, that fixed it every time it's been fixed in history. the problem with most of the Muslim Ummah today is that we don't know our past. We don't know the things that fixed it before, so we keep attaching ourselves to ideologies that in actuality will create a bigger mess. You know, if you look at the Sunnah of Allah, the way of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow a society to exist and flourish so long as it is just. And it doesn't matter whether that society is Muslim or non-Muslim. And again, we can look throughout history. Even during the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where did he send the Muslims from Mecca first to seek refuge? He sent them to Abyssinia, which was ruled by a Christian king. And he told them as he was sending them away, that go to him because he is just, and he does not allow injustice in his land. Whenever any society, even those societies, that were believers, you look at historically, even those societies that were societies of believers, when they became unjust, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a punishment upon them. We speak about Fir'aun, but of course Fir'aun was a non-believer. Fir'aun claimed himself to be God. Of course, when you look at his kingdom, so much injustice. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the punishments. And eventually Musa alayhi salam is able to take Bani Israel out of Egypt. When we look at when they eventually occupied Jerusalem, and they started spreading mischief throughout the earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, he mentions 2 times, but the first time is when he sends the army of Nebuchadnezzar, Bakht-Nakhar. And what does he do? He goes to Jerusalem, he flattens the city, and he takes all of them as slaves to Babylon. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the army of Nebuchadnezzar in the Quran, and he says that it was the army of Allah, which is interesting because the people of Nebuchadnezzar himself and his people were idol worshippers. They were mushrik. The people of Bani Israel were the Muslims of the time. They were the believers of the time. And yet the army that comes and fights the believers of the time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to that army as his army. The standards for the believers are not the same as the standards for the disbeliever, because the believer should know. The believer should know better. And if he does injustice or violates the laws of Allah, then he has no excuse. The non-believers, well, they don't know. Or some of them claim not to know. So again, the standard changes. When we look at the history of Jerusalem itself, it's very interesting because every time that Jerusalem has been occupied by anyone other than the Muslims, there's been bloodshed. When the Christians initially took over Jerusalem, what did they do? When Umar entered the city, when the Muslims finally conquered Jerusalem, during the Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anhu, he enters the city. Because, and we mentioned this before, but eventually he enters the city. They hand him the key to the city. The governor of the city at that time, who's handing over the key, of course, is Christian rule. And Umar radiyallahu is walking around the city, and he sees no Jewish people. So he asked the governor, he says, why are there no Jews here? This is a city that's sacred to everyone. He said, we just wiped them out when we came. And when we entered the city, we slaughtered everybody. You look at the Inquisition. This is historical. This is what they do. Just slaughtered everybody. Eventually, during the First Crusades, the year 1099, Christian era, the Crusaders eventually took Jerusalem back from the Muslims. And again, what did they do when they enter the city? They wiped everybody out. Because during the Khilafah of Umar, he had some Jewish people come and resettle in Jerusalem. And then some other Jewish people came after that. So when the Muslims were ruling, Jerusalem was a safe haven for anybody, irregardless of what religion they professed. So you have, by this time, by 1099, you have a decent population of Christians, Jews, and a large population of Muslims living in Jerusalem. But when the Crusaders entered, what did they do? They wiped out everybody that was not Christian. We know, Umar, or Jerusalem was conquered by the Muslims during the reign of Umar radiallahu anhu. And most of us also know that it was eventually taken back, after the First Crusades. It was eventually taken back by Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahmatullah alayh. If you read his history, it's very interesting. But when he enters the city, and I'm going to go back a little bit before, but mention this part. When he enters the city, all of these people that had been fighting against him were expecting him to do the same thing to them that they had done to the people previously. And yet, what does he do? He ransoms them all and allows them to leave freely. And they are shocked. They said, aren't you going to kill us? He said, no, I'm Salahuddin. I am the believer in La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I am the follower of the one who established justice in the world. What most people don't realize, and they don't want to realize, is if you look at the Muslim kings, the Khulafā Rashidin are the Khulafā Rashidin, totally different category. But if you look at the just Muslim kings who came later on, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we said, the Khilafah will be for 30 years, after which will come a cruel monarchy, after which will come the age of tyrants, which we're in today, after which will come Imam Mahdi and Isa alayhi salam. So, but if you look at the age of the kings, the cruel monarchy, you have amongst them some that are decent. The overwhelming trend is cruelty, if you look at the vast majority of the kings, but you have amongst them those that are decent. Simple example of the decency is Umar bin Abdul Aziz, rahmatullah alayh. But you also have other kings that are decent after him. Mahmud Ghaznavi. And of course, Salahuddin Ayyubi. But if you look at the history of these just kings within the Muslim era, during the era of the kings, they were all the followers of some friend of Allah, some awli Allah. You know, if you look at Mahmud Ghaznavi, who conquered northern India, he was the disciple of Abul Hasan Kharqani, who was the disciple of Bayezid Bustami, who was the disciple of Imam Jafar Sadiq, who was the disciple of Qasim bin Muhammad bin Abu Bakr, who was the disciple of Salman Farsi, and who was the disciple of Abu Bakr Siddiq, radiallahu anhuma, who of course is Abu Bakr, you know, the friend of Rasulullah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there's that connection with the awliyaullah. So if I look at Salahuddin, and everybody likes to take his name, and you see all these people that, oh, Salahuddin, Salahuddin, but then when you ask them, okay, whose disciple was he? You know, they don't know. Or they choose not to know at that moment. Salahuddin, if you look at his history, he is Kurd. He spoke 4 languages: Arabic, Kurdish, Farsi, and Turkic. When he was a young boy, his father was a disciple of Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani rahmatullah. And that's why I'm mentioning him specifically now, also because of the situation that's going on. His father, again, is the disciple of Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani rahmatullah, the king of the awliyaullah. When he was a young boy, his father took him to his sheikh, to his bir, to his murshid. And Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani put his hand on his neck, and he says to his father, he says that this young boy, this boy will have a very bright future, and he will be the protector of the lives and the properties of the Muslims. It wasn't long after this meeting that the first crusade took place, and Jerusalem falls back into the hands of the Christians. As Salahuddin grows up, he eventually gains position in Egypt, which was then ruled by the Fatimites, which were a group of Ismaili Shias. He was there as an envoy, but eventually gained a reputation and trust of the leaders there as well. They eventually, the Fatimites, made a deal with the Pope about allowing, crusaders to come and go. And this is basically when Salahuddin eventually took over Egypt, cut off the pipeline. And then in 1187, he, with his army, take over Jerusalem as well, reconquer Jerusalem. If you look at his army, the vast majority of his army are also disciples of Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani rahmatullah. His sword is still in one of the museums in Turkey. And on one side of his sword, it says, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. On the other side of his sword, it says, Ya Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani. So again, if you look at history, and when the Muslims flourished, they flourished under the leadership of those who were the disciples of the friends of Allah. Of course, in 1187, he takes over Jerusalem, and this is what triggered what they call the Third Crusades. This is when Richard the Lionhearted joined forces with the King of France, and they come and attack. And of course, Salahuddin defeated them as well. And he had made a promise to Richard the Lionhearted that you will never enter Jerusalem, which he never did. It's also interesting that, during the battle, the main battle that took place, the Crusaders sent prostitutes to the Muslims to try to get them to be involved in sins. And so if they could do that, then they could beat them. They knew this. And the Muslims, of course, didn't fall for this trick. And this is an old trick, wasn't a new trick even then. Various forces had tried this with Muslim forces even before. So long as the Muslims held to their principles, the help of Allah came. As we mentioned, when Salahuddin enters Jerusalem, he is very just and merciful to the people. Justice is one thing, but he is just and merciful to the people. Because again, he is the disciple of Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani rahmatullahi, who is on the pattern of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even today, if you talk to most of the Christians living in Jerusalem, they will acknowledge that the Muslims protected their churches and protected them and protected all of the worship places, irregardless of whose worship place it was. If you look at all the other people, historically, and the same thing today, they have no respect for anything. Not for anyone's worship place, irregardless of whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim, they don't care. In this recent attack, one of the first places that was destroyed was the third oldest church in Christendom, which was in Gaza. That was one of the first places that they destroyed. And this is why, just like with Firaun, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Firaun a leash, He gave him time, but eventually, when he reined in the leash, we know what happened. These people, even though they may claim lineage to Ibrahim alayhi salam, in reality they are the followers of Firaun. And this is why they do what they do. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them a leash as well. And He lets it loose. He's let them loose upon us because we have strayed away from what we're supposed to be doing. And again, we have to know our history. We don't even know the history of the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We look at what happened in Hunayn. We look at what happened in Uhud. These should be lessons for us. These should be reminders to us to come back to where we're supposed to be. We could, go on about all this, but again, so long as we did what we were supposed to do, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent His help. And His help comes in two forms. It comes in many forms, but two specific forms that I want to mention right now. One form of help is what we call the obvious victory. And everybody recognizes this, you're victorious. But the other form of help is when he makes you firm and gives you patience. So that when the difficulties come, the only thing that comes from your mouth is Alhamdulillah. Hopelessness is kufr, as is ungratefulness. Both of these are disbelief. So the believer is always grateful. And the believer is always hopeful with his Lord. So this is where we need to not only watch our tongues, but our hearts. And this is where many of us fail. And the steadfastness and sabr is more difficult than the gratefulness many times. You know, this gets back to human psychology. Many of us, when things are good, we forget. This is also ungratefulness. When things get hard, then, we remember. But if the hardship persists, then we fall into hopelessness. That are we the only ones left for this type of situation? And this is unfortunately not an uncommon statement that we hear from the Muslims today. So, we need to go back to Islam. We need to go back to the reality of those who earned the help of Allah, to whom Allah's help came. And we need to do this as an ummah. Of course, the ummah starts off with the individual. This is why Allah says in the Quran that save yourselves and your family, and then everyone else. It's like even when you're on the plane, what do they tell you? If something happens, make sure you put your own mask on first before you put anyone else's mask on. If you can't breathe, you're no good to anyone else. If my heart is dead, then what good am I to anyone else? So this connection between those who were successful in the past and the friends of Allah if it's broken, which in itself is zulm, it's an oppression, it's an injustice. When we sin, we are doing what? We're doing zulm or oppression upon ourselves. And this is one of the first lessons that Adam al-Islam taught his progeny. This is why even before being expelled from Jannah, what does he say? رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. That, our Lord, we have oppressed ourselves, our own nafs. The problem is we don't even look at sin as an oppression anymore. And then again, we keep asking, why are we in the situation we're in? The answer is staring back at us, but we choose not to look. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to see the reality of things. May He help all of those that are being oppressed in Palestine. and throughout the world. And may He destroy the oppressors. And may He take us out of that category of oppressors. May He fill our hearts with His true love and the true love of His beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his family, his companions, and all those whom they love. Those who have not made sunnah, go ahead and make sunnah, inshallah.